Hi, I'm Kim Eddleston with FamilyBusiness.org, and today I'm with Diana Clark, Chief of Clinical Operations at O'Connor Professional Group, a company well known for their behavioral health programs and their family-based approach towards fostering mental health and recovery. And I'm speaking with Diana today, who's the perfect expert, because one of the most common questions I get when giving workshops about succession and preparing that next generation is, how should I be parenting and raising my children? And Diana is perfect to give us advice on this.
I don't know how perfect I am, but I will certainly talk because I love to talk about parenting and what we've seen in the last 50 years in terms of shifts. So humor me, I will get there in a minute. 50 years ago, it was incumbent upon us to prove our worth to our parents. It was our job to show that we got our homework done. It was our job to go out and play and come back at dinner and wash and do our chores. That was our job. It wasn't felt so much like parents were looking for approval from their kids or looking to actually prove their value as parents. And that has flipped. Okay, so these second gen, or the first gen maybe, the wealth creators grew up with much less oversight in some very fundamental ways. They were allowed to make mistakes. And in that making of mistakes, they were able to learn resilience. They learned coping strategies. They learned humility sometimes. They learned some really valuable lessons, and it toughened up their skin. So now let's fast forward 50 years, and parents are really trying to hustle their worth to their kids. This changed in the baby boomers. And while there are better connections between parents and kids in many, many cases, there really are. We are more connected to our kids. That comes at a cost. And one of the costs is that we have done too much and we have deprived in some ways our kids of these experiences called failure that they learn from. So really what I'm suggesting to parents who want to prepare next gen is do less. Say less, watch more, but do less. Let them experience the consequences of whatever they are living.
That's good advice. And I was raised the other way, like you were mentioning, where, there was a lot more freedom, but our parents didn't jump in and save us all the time, unless it was something major. So how would I make that transition?
So I think we can really, depending on the age of the kids, okay? So if they're young kids, and this starts really young, watching a 2-year-old who wants to help, or a 3-year-old set the table and do it wrong and not leap in and have to show it to them again, to let it be wrong, and maybe have, like at the dinner table, have that come to the fore, but let them learn that early that everything they do isn't necessarily going to be praised, that everything they do has results. Let them participate starting very, very young, putting their own backpacks together in the morning, at least participating in the lunch preparation. All of these things get people prepared for the bigger, more important decisions along the way.
So it sounds like you don't agree with all the children getting a participation trophy.
I don't, because what we found is that constant praise actually is hurting our kids. What we find is that they become more risk averse because they're so dependent on receiving praise that they no longer take risks where they're going to do something bad. So as parents, according to Gail Saltz of the Child Mind Institute, as parents, we're really better off praising that thing that is difficult, praising, even if it's a failure, praising the effort of trying something hard.
in preparing that next generation to be responsible business owners and leaders, besides stepping back and not doing everything in the constant praise, what are some other ways parents can support their children's growth?
You know, we're really busy these days, and there's very little time for us to have even family conversations. We may not be around a dinner table, we may not be around a breakfast table. We are busy. What we know is that unless these conversations happen, we don't have nearly the voice we want to have in their learning our value systems, in learning what is important to us, and even learning the struggles we went through and the failures we walked through, because they're going to fall down and they're going to fail. And what they need is a model of somebody who got back up, not a model of somebody who never fell.
How do you share your family's values, like even identifying them and then making sure your children understand this is who we are?
So there are groups of people who specialize in this work, who help families cull their values from huge lists of things. You know, if the value professes to be one of service, for instance, then the family needs to actually engage in service. So more than learning what we call the values, I'm going to ask families to watch their feet. If they say my kids are on the phone too much, I want parents and initial generations looking how much time they're on the phone.
That's good homework. So why do so many from the next generation seem to be struggling?
I think they're struggling younger in some ways, right? They're growing up slowly. When the milestones that people reached in their early 20s and the 70s aren't really reached until their 30s now. So there is this elongated experience, which is now called emerging adulthood or adult light. And in adult light, they're learning different tasks than we learned in that same period, because we were doing commitment like things like buying houses and having kids and getting careers. They are doing way more exploration in that 20 something period. So I think, first of all, don't be quick to judge the measure at 21 and compare it to our 21, because it's comparing apples to oranges. The era is very different, and we raised them very different.
I often hear business owning families talk about how they were raised, as you mentioned at the beginning, for good or for bad. So how does the way we were raised end up impacting our ability to parent?
So I think we learned two things from our parents: what we want to be and what we don't want to be. I didn't like the way my mother did blank. I'm going to do it differently. And we consciously parent in ways that are a different experience. Then there are the hidden ones that just seep in, that seem to come directly out of your mother's mouth and out of yours. You didn't even mean it. It didn't pass go. You didn't collect $200 like in Monopoly. It just came right out of a generational expression. And those are the ones that we do more often than our conscious parenting. And so we have to look at, what are we trying to pass down to our kids in some ways?
But from the beginning, it sounded like if we parented more like our parents, we would be more effective.
Our parents talked less. I'm not suggesting we don't have family meetings, and I'm not suggesting that we don't connect, because that is really essential. When a kid struggles, it is those parents who have maintained connections throughout teen and early adulthood that seem to have a better voice in the healing process. So that is clear. Connection matters. But constant advice, constant oversight, constant kibitzing does not generate that same level of connection that we may in fact be seeking. It's a substitution.
If you were going to try to let your child fail, give them more freedom, more responsibility, there's a problem, because they're also influenced by their peers and they look
They
to
are.
their peers. So, for
Yeah.
example, I did have my children make their own lunches, and my teenage child sees it as bad parenting. And she tells me I'm the only parent who, um, so how do you, and that's just a small example, but
It's a
how,
great example. It's a great example because doing what I'm suggesting is counterculture right now. Doing more for our kids is the norm. Making sure that we are making life easy. Snowplow parents, drone parents, trash compactor parents. There's a million names for these Swiffer parents, the ones who can actually make the mess look good, but, doesn't really deal with the dirt. All of these are part of the current lexicon of what kind of parents we have out there. It's not working. Our kids are not thriving. Our next gens are not thriving, in part because they don't have experience. And we have to let them, and that starts young. And if we didn't do it young, then we need to sit down and say, hey, I want to own something. I have done too much. I'm going to back off. I'm going to bite my tongue. I'm going to not offer unsolicited advice. And when you catch me doing that, please highlight it for me. That's a legitimate conversation.
oh, I think we could all do that. And that makes it so you're also having a conversation with a child so that they know you're trying to be a better parent. Because it is tough. We compare ourselves to others, and we're all trying to be hopefully good parents. So that's very good to have that conversation.
So
So,
there was an author who wrote the book, The Road Less Traveled, many, many years ago. It was a bestseller for weeks and weeks and months. And this was in the 70s. And one of the quotes I remember from him that wasn't in the book is, it doesn't really matter what decisions you make as a parent in most instances. It matters that you struggled about it, that you thought about it, and that you communicated your thoughtfulness.
and why what works for one child doesn't work for another.
That's the cosmic joke, right? You think you get it figured out with child one, and then child two comes along, and they're entirely different, and they need entirely different skill sets and kinds of parenting.
So I assume that preparing that next generation to be responsible adults, as you're saying, it starts very young. You even gave a great example of age 3. So if you were talking to parents, business owning families of a new kindergarten student, what advice would you have for them?
Really starting with day one. Kindergarten is your job. You know how I have a job? That's your job. And let them make mistakes on it. Let them do it poorly. Let them experience that early. Don't leap in and correct the syntax on your 5-year-old's first essay.
And so it sounds like as they get older, we shouldn't be doing their science fair projects.
Totally. Or in my case, and so I say this because I lived it, my older son, when he went off to college, we like to think we collaborated on that essay for the college entrance exam. I think I wrote it.
So how do we know when they need our help? When they honestly need our help and we have to step in versus this is a time to let them do it and take ownership.
I would look at, is there a mental health crisis? Are we seeing symptoms of sleep disorder, eating disorder? Are we seeing, a mood or a dysregulation? Are we seeing lots of symptoms that have gone on for a couple of weeks? And that is time when you bring in the troops and you get professional assistance. You don't just say, well, they need to learn from this. A couple of weeks is really where I draw a line and say, we need to get you professional help.
And so let's say I have, my adult children are in their late 20s, even early 30s. And now I'm realizing, oh my goodness, I've created a disaster. Can they be helped?
It is never too late. I see people in their 70s get on the right medication and thrive for their last chapters of life. I've seen kids who were complete knuckleheads in their teenage years, and 10 years later are the people you want to be around and hire and date and all of those things.
Never give up. You never give up on your children.
You don't give up. You just channel the way you're going to parent, not if you're going to.
Thank you, Diana. This was excellent. I should also mention, if you enjoyed this, you should also look at our earlier video about spoiled children. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim.